know it's closed, but
Okay, now the library is closed and the program will begin.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
We're open.
We're open. The library itself is closed. Good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight or being virtual with us this evening online. So this program is streaming live right now to both our YouTube and our Facebook channels. So we are here in the auditorium, but we are not alone. So we are happy to be hosting this very special Writers Live, as I said, both in person and virtually, and want to make sure that we welcome everyone here inside Wheeler Auditorium because we are so excited to begin hosting smaller programs in person while promoting social distancing and safety. All of the Pratt's 22 locations are open and serving the public. So I encourage anyone watching who doesn't have a Pratt Library card to get online, not right now, you're going to do it after the program. You're going to get online and get yourself an e-card today because it will immediately give you access to all of our collections. Now, for tonight's big event, we are so excited to welcome Arnold Lehman back to Baltimore. He's the past director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. He's the director emeritus at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and currently he's the senior advisor at Phillips, an international auction house for modern and contemporary art. His book is called Sensation: The Madonna, the Mayor, the Media, and the First Amendment. You can get a copy of Sensation from our friends at the Ivy Bookshop. And tonight, he's in conversation with Baltimore's very own WYPR's Midday, Tom Hall. So please welcome Arnold and Tom. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Heidi. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see the folks who are with us here in the auditorium and to see the folks in Zoom land. And how about a hand for Heidi Daniel? She just finished her second half marathon. She ran a half marathon here in Baltimore, 13.2 miles, if that's not impressive. And she runs a heck of a library as well. But Arnold, welcome back. Welcome home. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I thought you were talking about Heidi running a marathon in terms of running the library. Same
well, that's a marathon too.
Right.
Yeah, running the library. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to start with some slides and some visual stuff that Arnold's going to explain, and then we'll chat amiably.
Yeah, I thought, and I'm going to do this a little more informally than I would normally, but I thought it would be good for everyone here tonight to sort of set, as Tom said, a visual stage, because many of you, I'm certain, might have some knowledge of the exhibition and what followed in terms of the exhibition, but that memory, as mine, is likely waning. So this is going to bring you back up to speed. It's going to continue my nightmares that I have every few nights. My wife will tell you that's absolutely true. But this was before the exhibition opened, and before we had such a extreme response to it. We did some advertising with tongue-in-cheek about the exhibition, and this was one of those advertisements that we pulled very quickly when people thought that it was not a very appropriate thing to use in regard to the exhibition. So let's continue with the next slide. This, in fact, is the book that Tom is talking about, so everyone can run out and buy it with the specific subject of the ire of the mayor and a number of people in New York on the cover. And the next slide gives you a sense of what went on in front of the museum almost every day for 3 months. The crowds, the protesters, pro and con, mostly I have to say pro, because the polls in New York City suggested that 67 to 70% of New Yorkers were with the museum and told the mayor and others to lay off. Next slide. This is the catalog cover, which to to this very moment makes me shiver when I look at it. And because as a child, I once paid my respects and admiration for a hot toaster that gave me all these wonderful treats. And I once kissed that toaster and had blistered lips for weeks after that. So when I saw the catalog cover, I thought, oh, we're in trouble. The next slide, please. I was left Baltimore in 1997 to run this museum in Brooklyn, which at that point, and I think still is, the second biggest museum collection in the country, and was among the biggest buildings for housing a museum until places like Houston started expanding and expanding. But along with taking over the logistics of running this huge staff, I was asked by the board basically to move the museum from the 19th century to the 21st century without stopping in the 20th. They wanted to retake a leadership role in contemporary art that had been slowly diminished, but was based on history of extraordinary contemporary exhibitions for almost 100 years. And the next slide. And this brings me back to Baltimore. One of the reasons, actually, that Sensation came to Brooklyn was that I was the last major exhibition that I did for the Baltimore Museum was this exhibition called A Grand Design, which was about the treasures of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I spent an inordinate amount of time in London, probably a little bit more than I needed to. I have someone shaking their head over here about that. But I made over 30 trips to London during a period of several years, working on this exhibition and trying to convince the V&A to lend things that they would never lend. So it took a very long period of time. But while I was in London, I became very aware of the contemporary art scene there. I got involved in it. I visited all the contemporary galleries. I met with a lot of artists who were working there, and also met on a number of occasions Charles Saatchi, who is the major contemporary artist, collector in Great Britain and perhaps in Europe at that time, and ran his own museum, which I was at very often. I knew all these artists. I knew their work very, very well. Next slide. So when I heard that the Royal Academy, which had organized the exhibition, might be willing to lend it, might be willing to show it in the United States, it was already committed to going to Berlin after London, but there were no commitments. And so I'd have to say I badgered them because going into the millennium, the new millennium, I thought, what could be better than this extraordinary exhibition of the most avant-garde artists working in England, and at that time, probably in Europe at this moment. And it would be great for our public, terrific for the museum, and it would announce our new commitment to contemporary art. But what you see on the screen is an interesting combination. On the back wall, you see an image of a woman who's named Myra Henley. It was a painting by Marcus Harvey, who is one of the group called the YBAs, Young British Artists. It's about 11 feet by 9 feet, a huge painting. And it was created having the artist had molds of children's hands made. And with those children's hands, he painted this portrait, which you can see is a little fuzzy. The closer you got up to the portrait, the more it dissolved into these hands. But the further away you got, the portrait came forward. And the reason for the use of these children's hands, and this is, as I said, a portrait of Myra Henley, who in the 1960s was a serial murderer of children. And they were all buried in the moors. I'm not exactly sure which moors, but they were all buried there. And subsequently, she admitted to murdering more children. So she was at least one of the most despicable human beings in terms of the British public. In the mid-90s, there was a bill in Parliament to have her paroled. She had been arrested in the 1960s, and she had served about 35 years, and to have her paroled. And there was this enormous outcry on the part of the public. And Marcus Harvey, the artist, wanted to remind the public about what she had done. And so that is the reason for the portrait being painted. In London, it caused outrage in terms, especially at the Royal Academy, which is made up of a very significant group of traditional artists. But they all, yes, hold on for a minute, go back one. But they all determined that if they were to take this painting out of the exhibition, to do that kind of self-censorship would start them on a road that they might not be able to control afterwards. And so they voted grudgingly to include the painting in the exhibition. So that was going to come to Brooklyn. An outrage in London, totally of no interest to most museum goers. They didn't know the backstory. So visually, it didn't have the kind of impact that the next slides would have. Like this, a work by the Chapman brothers, many sculptures of children showing them with genitals basically in all the wrong places. This is Ron Muick, his version of his dead father, half size on the ground. We had people sprawled out on the ground all around him trying to compare their body size to his. Next slide. And Mark Quinn, this is the famous portrait, self-portrait in his own frozen blood. Again, another work of art that caused a lot of concern in Great Britain and in Brooklyn. And perhaps the most, the artist who caused the most amount of emotional concern was Damien Hurst. This is his very famous shark, a very ferocious shark, in about 200 gallons or more of formaldehyde. And the next, and another Damien Hurst with this cow cut up. And I think this is one that was cut into 12 slices. And interestingly, in advance, I made sure I spoke to the people from PETA so that they would not be outraged by this, but it didn't work. They were still outraged. All of this, when I was in London, of course, I saw these incredible lines in front of the Royal Academy, but lines made up not just of young people, but people of color, artists, some artists I even knew, a kind of line going to the Royal Academy that they never had before. This is not the Royal Academy, this is Brooklyn, but the same thing. We had a very young audience, an audience filled with artists, and also a lot of people who had never been in the museum previously. The lines went on some days for 5 hours, and that's with people who had tickets. Next slide. Before the exhibition even opened, weeks before, the newspapers in New York City started this media frenzy that just continued on for 6 months. Very rarely does a work of art get on the front cover of the Daily News, or for that matter, any newspaper in New York City. But these front pages went on throughout the first month and a half. And there was at least, I thought there would be at least one article in each newspaper each day. Sometimes there were 4, 5, and 6 articles in each newspaper every day. But Tom was just saying, can you imagine what would it have been like if we were in the age of the internet? I mean, at that point, everyone read newspapers, or they listened to the radio, or they watched television. If this had been a moment for the internet, I doubt that I'd be alive at this moment. So what became the critical work in this exhibition is this painting of the Holy Virgin Mary by the Anglo-African artist Chris Ofili. Parents Nigerian. He grew up in Great Britain, in London, and worked on canvases, most of which just absolutely glowed. This canvas looks like it is just made out of tesserae, and you can see around her head a kind of a halo that he created. Two things stood out in this painting. It wasn't the typical Holy Virgin Mary image that Americans or even New Yorkers were used to, although certainly in Africa, where there are many Catholics and other Christian denominations, they most often looked at and prayed to a Black Virgin Mary, as do others throughout Europe. But not only was it a Black Madonna, but he had fashioned the breast of the Madonna out of elephant dung and decorated it, shellacked, dried and shellacked, and then carefully delineated with beads and beaded pins that went into the elephant dung. And he also created, the painting wasn't suspended from the wall, but rather it stood on 2 feet of elephant dung. So it created a more three-dimensional effect for the painting, because Chris felt that it was a painting that had a much more volume than if it had been on the wall itself. In Africa, where he also studied, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, elephant dung was used medicinally, and it often was a poultice that people in a community, if a woman especially had an infected breast while after a birth and couldn't provide milk, they would use elephant dung to take the infection out of the breast. So it had powers that were life-giving, that, of course, no Americans, certainly no journalists, knew about or cared to investigate. So next slide, please. These were just a few of the, I think, 26,000 comment cards that we received, in addition to inordinate numbers of volumes where people wrote in. And we had about 170,000 people for the exhibition, most of whom were there and praised the exhibition. Again, the crowds in front, you see people holding posters, defend the First Amendment. I don't think I might have a slide on here that shows people with the Virgin Mary. There you go. The way they saw the Virgin Mary. And this went on day after day after day. TV trucks with their antenna went up and down Eastern Parkway. There must have been 15 or 20 TV trucks, again, for months on end. And the next slide. And all of that was fine until several weeks before the exhibition opened. The mayor of New York, then Rudy Giuliani, said that he was offended by the exhibition, that it was disgusting, that it was sick, and that he was going to stop it. And he was especially going to get us to pull the Holy Virgin Mary from the exhibition, which was particularly offensive to him as a practicing Catholic. And he said further on that the museum was in fact Catholic bashing, and he wouldn't stand for it. So this is just one of, again, the front page of a New York newspaper. Next. Okay. That it looks like I have a mustache in there, but I never did. In any event, it was the only time I was on the front page of the New York Post. I was inside the New York Post, or was it the Daily News, when I woke up one morning and the lead editorial said, "You better update your resume, Arnold." Most people don't wake up to a newspaper that has a million readers with that kind of editorial. Next page, please. This, in fact, before we get to this, the one slide I don't have is the headline on the Amsterdam News, which was, and still is, I believe, the largest Black-owned and run newspaper in the country. And the publisher himself wrote the headline, and it said, "A Black Madonna, Rudy's greatest nightmare." So that beautiful painting, only several weeks before the exhibition was over, was defaced by this elderly man who also attacked abortion clinics, I might add, who temporarily we had to put up metal detectors for people to get into the museum. It's not our normal way of welcoming people into the institution. But he slipped through the metal detectors because he had a tube, a big plastic tube, squeeze bottle of white paint in his pocket, which didn't register on the metal detectors. Came up, told the guards around this that he was having a heart attack. And so the guards went off to call for help, and another one to get water, another one to get a chair, and in the meantime slipped behind the huge sheet of plexiglass and did this to the painting. Next slide. This is, at the end, I didn't even mention that we sued Rudy Giuliani in federal court. We sued him personally and his position as mayor. And finally, he appealed the first decision of the district court, which was in favor of granting an injunction to the Brooklyn Museum against the mayor. And when the Court of Appeals heard the testimony and went into recess, within hours, he pleaded to settle the case. And this is the Daily News reporting that. This, of course, is a more familiar image of Giuliani more recently. And last but not least, again, is an image of the book. And you're going to learn a lot more by listening to Tom's really good questions, I'm sure. And also, if you have a chance to read this book. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Arnold. That's just
And here I said I wasn't going to spend much time doing that.
No, that's just great. So I wondered, the subtitle of the book is The Madonna, the Mayor, the Media, and the First Amendment. Let's take them in order. All right?
In order?
In order.
Okay.
So I want to ask you about Chrysophily and the Holy Virgin Mary. You mentioned that there is a medicinal tradition of using elephant dung. That is, of course, a difficult message to get out in the media. You're an art historian, but it's tough to convey that kind of stuff. What has happened to Chrysophily since? Has he continued to work with elephant dung? In the book, you refer to him as the Rembrandt of dung. So this was something he had used.
I didn't refer to him as that.
Well,
we're the British paper.
Okay, somebody
right.
And is the because he had done this many times prior to this particular painting. Did he continue to work, and what happened to Chris O'Feely after he was the center of this controversy?
Well, let me answer the very first part of that question. Of course, again, no one saw this painting before all these stories were written, before the mayor attacked the museum. And it was often said in the papers that the painting was smeared with elephant dung, that the elephant dung was splashed on the painting. And of course, that was absolutely not the case, which proved that neither the mayor or any of his people, nor any of the reporters ever saw the painting. And had you seen this painting and looked at the other paintings of his in the exhibition, you would have seen that he used elephant dung in a celebratory way, because the painting that was just next to this, around the corner from this, was a painting of all of his musical heroes, all of his jazz heroes. And there were lots of balls of elephant dung with the names of these heroes. So it was always meant to be celebratory, or at least to be positive. And again, of the 4 or 5 paintings in our exhibition, at least 4 had elephant dung on them, again, in a very positive way. Chris went on to use elephant dung a little bit more. He was very stung by this criticism. And while Americans are so insular that although you would think New Yorkers or other people living in large cities with communities of color would have a little bit of idea that people celebrated things differently, they prayed differently, they had different heroes and heroines. But even it really was amazing to see that how badly this was reported in the press. There finally was an article by a distinguished art historian who said, let's review this. Let's look at the press and put some blame where it's deserved. Chris O'Feely has gone on to be an enormously successful artist. He lives part-time in the Caribbean, part-time, I think, in Connecticut, part-time in London. I wish I had that life. And he continues to paint really engaging, interesting work. And his work is in every major museum of the country, in the country.
Yeah, it's interesting. This exhibition opened in October of 1999. It was more than 20 years ago. And you told me the other day, and you mentioned it even tonight, that you continue to lose sleep over the experience of going through this controversy, which, as you say, lasted nearly 7 months. I mean, it was a long extended time, sort of a 24/7 barrage. I wonder, why did you decide now was the time to revisit it and to write the book and to publish your account, which is, as I said today on the air, it's not only day by day. In some cases, it's hour by hour. What was going on in the press? What was going on behind the scenes? What was going on in the museum itself? Why now?
Well, I was affected by this not just as a museum director doing his job, and not just as an art historian, but my life was threatened. I was subjected in the streets, in the subways, to close to physical violence. People came up to me and threatened me. Outside our apartment building, people threatened me coming out. I had a bodyguard for weeks on end. They demanded that I wear a bulletproof vest. I wouldn't do it because I thought it made me look fat. And vanity.
God bless vanity.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. I was taught how in New York City, I was taught how to drive defensively by going backwards in one-way streets, by turning around. And I said, I'm going to get a ticket. He said, or you're going to get shot. You choose. So all of this has remained with me. And has really remained with me. And I've always wondered what I might have done wrong. Had I done something differently? Had we responded differently, presented this differently? And it's really, taking me a lot of time to come to terms with that.
Mhm.
But it also was very clear by a number of people telling me that this story has to be told, that no one's going to go back and pick up the clips from various newspapers, and that the story has to be told. But most importantly, having experienced the last 5 years of seeing how many of my museum colleagues are practicing a great deal of self-censorship, how university communities are just being torn apart by who can speak, who can't speak, and why. The First Amendment is really being put to the test today. And I think what happened then had a great deal of relevance. And I started writing this book 2 years into the last administration. And it took 3 years to write it, to pull together some loose ends. I normally do write very fast. This was not written very quickly. But I have to compliment my wife, who kept, as you said, not just day by day, but hour by hour, minutes throughout this controversy, and presented me, when I started to write this, with 98 pages of single space, no space between the lines, typed pages of notes, and also the luminous books with every clipping from every newspaper for all those months, as well as tape recordings of newspapers and news on TV. We happen to have 4 or 5 televisions in our house and radios, and all of them were on all of the time. It was a cacophony of news. And she recorded everything that she could. So I would have this archive of material to draw from. And if that hadn't been done, I have a good memory. And I pretty much remember, amazingly, what did happen on not a day-by-day basis, but close. And it had to be written.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the characters had changed, but like Giuliani, those personalities had come full circle and become even more, I felt, dangerous. So,
and you had Floyd Abrams as your lawyer,
thank goodness.
who was, of course, one of the great First Amendment scholars and legal minds in the country. He was the darling of the left when the Pentagon Papers were, that case came before the court. He defended the New York Times, and then he became the demon of the left in 2013 when he defended or won the case at the Supreme Court called Citizens United,
right,
allowing for corporate donations to political campaigns. So it sort of depends on where what your perspective is. But in addition to the legal dimension of this, I wonder, on reflection, because there's even an art historian that you quote in the book who says, even great art should not be above moral criticism. And if something is particularly offensive to a person because of her religion or because of whatever reason, is there any responsibility on behalf of an artist or a museum or people in the public realm that are presenting these things with the imprimatur of art? When you call something art, it elevates it to a particular level. Is there any obligation to be sensitive to that, and to be cognizant of it, and to be in any way accommodating of the fact that offense will be taken by people, and that's out of your control?
That is a great question. And believe me, we asked ourselves that question in many different ways for a very long period of time. Let me go back for a moment. When I received the materials from the Royal Academy, which was 600 pages of clippings and reports, and all the newspaper articles and summaries of TV and radio, somewhat like my wife did in New York. And in that, Chris O'Feely's name appeared 3 or 4 times. And this, now, some people always say that the British are more, you use a good word, accommodating to outside thinking outside the box. And they say, well, he's odd, and it just goes away. It's not as affected as this. But in that material, nowhere did it say that this picture had offended people. Everything else seemed to be offensive, but not it. And the most offensive was Myra Henley.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to Berlin, there was almost silence. The press in Berlin simply accepted the exhibition, and we thought we'd have a lot of provocation from, the Chapman brothers alone caused us a lot of concern, because we have lots of children in the museum going through. And we never believed that the O'Feely was going to would have the kind of response that it did. And I believe it would not have, except for the political issues that Giuliani used the painting for.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that and throughout I've been a museum director for 45 years, and we almost always bring together the curators, the educators, other people throughout the museum's various departments to talk about what's in the exhibition. And so we do give a lot of thought to it. But this aside, you're also going down a slippery slope when you begin to say, well, this painting will cause offense, and you try to figure out to whom, but will that one cause offense? And then who do you talk to about this? And I went to religious groups in Brooklyn. I presented the material. My wife always tells me that for years, if you Google me, the first thing that you saw in Google was that the Union of Orthodox Rabbis called for me to be fired because they thought this was offensive. We just didn't believe that we would be embroiled in this the way it was. But we also believed very strongly that you had to follow what the First Amendment says, because they're not looking at things individually. They're looking at the creation of a nation and the rules to follow in doing so. So it's a tough question. The answer to it is that I believe people have to assess what they do. And I'm not a very pugnacious person. I think I said in the book that I'm not what do you call someone who sets fires?
Pyromania.
Well, not a pyromaniac, but well, an arsonist. Thank you very much. I am not an arsonist. I was not prepared to burn the place down because of this. And the truth is, when I met with Giuliani, I presented all these provocative works. The Ophelia wasn't in it. And not because I wanted to hide it, simply because I didn't think it measured up to that level. So, but I've thought about this for years. And I also told you, I think this afternoon, that I've thought about what would have happened at this Bastille Day meeting had, it was on July 14th, had I shown the Ophelia. You know, would they have taken offense at the moment and the mayor exploded then and there? And I would have left the meeting, not figuratively, but literally with my head in hand. Oh, you're so right. You're so right. Well, maybe Bastille didn't mean anything to him. But I've thought about that for years.
Yeah. And speaking of the mayor, I mean, is it as simple, do you think, now looking back, an explanation that Mr. Giuliani did this out of political expediency? He was considering a run against Hillary Clinton for the U.S. Senate, which he ultimately decided not to do. He, of course, remained mayor of New York in 2001. He was America's mayor then. He asked to be given an extension of his term. He was turned down in that regard. But is it as simple as that this was a politically expedient thing? He made a calculation that more people would be with him than against him. And he was, of course, speaking to an audience greater than just the people in the 5 boroughs.
Oh, much more. First, I think it has to be said that this was one of about 25 times that he reacted to something in a way that created a First Amendment incident. 25 times. He lost all of those cases. He couldn't care less about the First Amendment. It was really, there was a comment, which I included in the book, that the mayor always got even. So that despite the ruling of the federal court, and that the public, 2/3 of the public was on our side, everyone was worried that, you know, I would disappear one day with no note left. That something really horrible would happen. But through the legal system, he was forced not only to return the $7 million that he took out of our subsidy, but $35 million that was allocated to the museum for capital projects that he had held up. And beyond that, he, in his capacity as mayor, didn't even have the authority to do it. It was city council that had the authority to do that. But, you know, he just dominated, he just rolled over everyone. And this, I don't think he was ever taught a lesson.
Ultimately, given the fact that he lost in court 10 years, 11 years earlier, the Art Museum in Cincinnati also won their case. This was around the Andres Serrano, the Piss Christ
The Mapplethorpe
thing, and the Robert Mapplethorpe photography exhibit. We remember those, some of us of a certain age. And so the courts have upheld museums' rights to display this material. You said, you know, 2/3 of New Yorkers were with you on your side. Do you think ultimately this was good for contemporary art? That this in fact moved forward the capacity of artists to express themselves and do their work however they please?
The answer to that is definitely. If you looked at the crowds of people who were going to see contemporary art, just in New York, forget the rest of the country for the moment, the crowds who were going at the end of the 20th century, the very beginning of the 21st, and you look, put aside COVID, you look at the crowds of people who are going to see contemporary art now, there's no comparison. If you look at, since I'm in the auction world, not on the auction side of the auction world, but in the auction world, contemporary art has pushed everything else aside. Impressionist painting, places like Sotheby's and Christie's, who have to deal with English furniture and rugs, and I mean, they're going out of their minds. They would like to have all that removed and only show contemporary art, because it is just dominating the field of the sale of art. People who would never bought a contemporary painting proudly have them, mixed in with their French Louis XIV, 16th furniture. We were at an apartment like that just the other night with Mark Bradford, one of the greatest American painters today, and in a room that was just completely filled with Louis XIV furniture and objets, and there was this great Mark Bradford on the wall. So we were not alone in creating this incredible interest. But I think for museum people who go back many years, when the Museum of Modern Art would do an exhibition of the most contemporary artists at that moment, there was no one in the galleries. They would go to, the 1950s, to abstract expressionism or earlier, and that would fill the galleries, but not contemporary. And it's just the reverse way today. So it definitely had an effect. And the artists, forget putting aside Christopher Feely, so many of these artists have had incredible careers subsequent to this.
What's this shark and formaldehyde worth these days? What's valuation of contemporary art is always fascinating, but if you wanted to buy it, what would it cost?
Well, first of all, this is a completely plastic surgically redone shark. The shark kind of got a little tatty from the formaldehyde.
As sharks do.
And if you live in formaldehyde, it gets to be a little acidic. I think, and I don't remember everything I wrote in the book, but I think that Saatchi sold the shark for something like 3 or 4 million pounds. And the last sale of the shark was 12 million pounds. You have to remember, this was a dead, diseased old shark and a lot of formaldehyde. The case was more expensive than any of the artistic elements. But the other thing that I add to this question is, where did the shark end up? Where did the Holy Virgin Mary end up? The Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I started my career, and the Museum of Modern Art either kept silent about this in terms of trying to assist a colleague, or, as in the case of Philippe de Montebello, my colleague and museum director of the Metropolitan Museum, wrote scathingly of the exhibition in the New York Times. Philippe de Montebello proudly showed me a number of years afterwards the shark at the Metropolitan Museum in their galleries, talking about how it reflected upon the work of so many other artists, and perhaps worst of all, the Holy Virgin Mary, which we bid on at auction, went to the Museum of Modern Art, where it's one of the proud parts of their collection. In fact, a friend was in their museum shop the other day and showed me a pile of books that high in the Museum of Modern Art shop, not because of me, but because it depicts one of the works in their collection. I think they have more books than anybody in the country at this point.
Well, it's a tawdry question to ask, how much
It's
is
not
some
at
art
all
worth?
Not
but
at all.
I couldn't resist. We have some questions from our friends here at the Enoch Pratt. For those of you who are on Zoom, we're going to share some of those for Arnold Lehman. Again, the book is called Sensation, the Madonna, the Mayor, the Media, and the First Amendment. This question says, in your opinion, what is the relationship between the disfiguration of the human and animal form and contemporary art?
So that I don't know if that person is in the audience or
Yes, this person is here with us tonight.
I'm not going to ask who that is. I'm assuming you're talking about the Damien Hurst in the exhibition, or maybe the Chapmans in the exhibition, or maybe Dead. I mean, there's so many things that could fill here that could be part of this question. I think certainly in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and you could look back in the Renaissance where artists were trying to understand the human figure, using it in different ways. There are many studies where there are the word grotesque was usually used to define them. The grotesque use of the human figure is not at all new in art history. But I think since it's it's the closest thing to us, I think artists look at it as a way to signify, or at least a way to get us to look at ourselves or the animals surrounding us in ways that we might not otherwise care to look at ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
There are many studies centuries ago where the human figure was turned inside out, and you were looking at the organs of the figure, and so it's a great question. But it is something that's been going on for a long time. People like the Chapmans, for instance, and even Mark Quinn, looking at himself, but creating himself out of blood.
With the blood, right.
Was really talking about what are we made of, where are we going, and how quickly we would melt if the refrigeration was turned off. And we came close to that incident.
That's right. Yeah, you had to keep it cool there.
We had to keep it cool, right.
Here's a question about the media, which is the last element of your title that we do need to touch on. What parallels are you seeing in the present day media that you witnessed during this event?
Well, there are so many. One thing that happens when you become the focal point of the press, when they're all over you and talking about you in a praiseworthy manner, but more likely as being critical. But you know what's happened at that time. You know the details, and the media is reporting it totally incorrectly. For whatever reason, they just may not get it right. I wish that was the case. But sometimes
did you find it was impossible to correct them? I mean, you had meetings with the publisher of the New York Times. You talked to people when you would have conversations with them to say, no, this isn't true. Here's what's true.
It was all disregarded.
Mm-hmm.
It was all disregarded. Even the New York Times, which, many of us grew up with, and thought that everything in the Times was true, without question. There's no reason to consider anything differently. An editorial in the Times said that no ethical museum shows private collections or material from private collections. One of the most significant, most important reporters for the New York Times wrote a story that showed that was totally incorrect, that every major museum in the country every museum in the world showed private collections, because part of the mission of those institutions was to take that material from private hands and bring it into the public's hands in terms of being in a not-for-profit institution. So once, in this case, I can't condemn every case, but in this case, I think they saw a lot of additional sales of newspapers. This was something that they never were writing about before, so they had a whole new audience for it. It just went on and on and on. And if it weren't attracting or keeping their audience, they would have turned to crime, the thing that newspapers normally report.
You got to admit there are some great headlines. I mean, Giuliani's dung deal. I mean, who wouldn't be proud of that? I mean, my gosh, that's
there
pretty
were
good.
Scores of them that they never used.
I've been told that we're almost out of time. So our last question, again, from the audience here at the Pratt: how do you combat misinterpretation of a work of art, or at least guide conversations around controversy? Is it just part of the art world? It's difficult to have conversations about interpretation of art because it can be interpreted all sorts of ways.
You get very wise people to sit on panels, to lecture, to write books, sometimes to be invited to write op-ed pieces for newspapers. But it's an uphill battle. But it's not just art. It's theater. It's writing. It's history. It's hard to correct perceptions once they become widespread. But I think you can't stop trying.
Finally, one last question, and I know we're almost done here, but Mr. Saatchi, of course, we know him from, he and his brother had this great advertising firm. I mean, he's a very, very, successful business person. Has he continued to be, the leading collector of contemporary art? Are figures like him paradigms for other people in the contemporary art world, people who are collecting and really getting to know the subject that they've become interested in? I mean, is Saatchi and the experience that Saatchi had with this exhibition, has he become someone that became a model for other people?
Well, it's very hard to use Saatchi as a model for anything, because he's almost an invisible figure, even 20 years ago, and now totally invisible. But he is far from being the leading collector today. There are so many major collectors in France and Germany, other collectors in England, in China, which is becoming perhaps the leading collecting nation of contemporary art.
In Bentonville, Arkansas.
Bentonville, Arkansas, where I have to say, I was just knocked over by how fantastic they've created that museum and what they do and the programs that they do. So I think the bottom line is that you have to support your local museum and believe in what they do and help them to do even more.
The book is called Sensation: The Madonna, the Mayor, the Media, and the First Amendment. Our guest has been Arnold Lehman. Arnold, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Arnold. And Tom, thank you so much for your moderation. It's been great having you as a guest. And thank you all for joining us. As we mentioned, it's really great to see faces back in the library for our events. A quick thank you, and also to all of our virtual audience. Thank you for tuning in tonight. If you haven't already online, please fill out our program survey posted earlier in the chat. Your input lets us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see in the future. A quick plug for everyone. This Friday, to get into the Halloween spirit, our special collections department has put down on the second floor here at the Central Library a collection of treasures from our special collections regarding Edgar Allan Poe. So from 10 to 4 this Friday, we'll be having an Edgar Allan Poe open house, 10 to 4 this Friday, Central Library in downtown Baltimore on the second floor here. And please visit prattlibrary.org for more of our really exciting upcoming events and resources that we're very proud to be providing the community. Again, thank you, Arnold. Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Alyssa, from the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for tonight's event. And on that, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Have a great night.
Good night.